Hi, everybody. Dr. Friedman here. This is week 2, day 1 of the Honors Research Seminar in TTRPG Actual Play. Honors Research Seminars are a little bit different from other courses that I teach. I teach them as an overload, which is to say that they're not part of my normal load of teaching, but they are something I do on top of it. And the purpose in the Honors College for research seminars is to give students the hands-on experience of doing real research alongside a professor. Most of these classes are, as you might imagine, in science, technology, engineering, and math, or what we call STEM fields. Lab sciences need a steady influx of newbies who are figuring out the ropes, for example. Humanities research seminars are a little bit different and harder to staff. A lot of humanities folks don't know how to wrangle students and what new student researchers can even do. So today I introduced the concept of what we were going to do for the rest of the semester in terms of how we're going to start to answer some questions about actual play. As students know, we are going to be developing a survey that we're hoping to deploy by the end of the semester, if not sooner. The other thing that we're going to do is some qualitative analysis of actual play episodes. And so one of the things that I introduced students to today was, we're collecting as many actual play shows as possible to make a master list from which students can draw for that task. They're going to be doing that from now until next Thursday, when we'll take a look and see where we are, what the state of play is. So that they understand why we're asking these questions and why they matter, today I did a very normally self-indulgent, but here pedagogically absolutely necessary thing, which is I had students read my research. And in fact, what I love about this project is the fact that I am actively trying to write for different audiences. So students got a taste of work both for a peer-reviewed academic book collection, one edited by Stephanie Hedge and Jennifer Grueling, as well as work that I have published for what we call public-facing work. Not peer-reviewed in the traditional sense, although it did go through rounds of editing and feedback and refinement. And those are the core texts for today. Is It Thursday Yet? A Study in Narrative Time in Critical Role, as well as an essay I wrote called Fantasy Friends for the 18th century born digital journal, The Rambling. And so we talked a little bit about different audiences, about what the rhetorical purpose was of each of these, and we talked about technical terms. So in the work that I've been producing for edited collections, like the one that Is It Thursday Yet appears in, and what we hope is a forthcoming follow-up that takes on Campaign 2 and beyond, the goal is to talk in narratological terms about the different narrative levels of actual play tabletop. So Jennifer Grueling, in her important book on narrative structures of tabletop role-playing games, talks about the levels at the table. So there's the level of the dungeon master who is reporting events and these sorts of things. There are players' utterances both in and out of character. There's planning. There's the storytelling level of what the dice rolls do. And then she argues that there is this extra diegetic level outside of the storytelling circle that she calls table talk. All of the stuff that's not actually related to the story being told together, that's nevertheless happening. This is the can you get me a beer, did you bring the flamin' hot Cheetos level. What I argue in Is It Thursday Yet? Is that level becomes part of the viewing experience that can add meaning once you're having people watch you play a tabletop role-playing game. And so In that piece, I talk about the finale of Critical Role's first campaign, the Vox Machina campaign. Spoilers ahoy. And so I talk about the emotional resonance that happened at the table that was really only experienced fully in retrospect, not live, which is to say, the moment where Sam Riegel must decide whether to use his ninth level spell to keep Vecna from fleeing and thus facilitate the closure of this campaign, or whether he should sacrifice that to keep the spell because his original intention for his ninth level spell slot was to cast Wish to somehow reverse the fate of Liam O'Brien, his best friend, the reason why this campaign even exists, revenant character Vax'ildan. He chooses to save the day, the table goes wild, and it's only in ripples that we see the sacrifice that has actually occurred. Now, lots of people have talked about this. Matt Colville talked about this in a video that is no longer available on YouTube, which is a super fucking bummer, I've got to say. It teaches extremely well, and I do a close reading of it in the other essay that I wrote, which talks about the same scene, but instead of trying to talk very technically about narrative levels, is trying to communicate to readers the reason why we watch actual play, which is these kinds of moments of emotional resonance that come not only from the story being told, but from the way of its telling and the embodied performances of people at a table. Some of my students were looking for this language to justify their own pleasure, as honestly, I, as a scholar, am doing as well, which is a new and unusual experience for me in teaching this class. A year ago, I was trying to explain what Critical Role was to a room that did not know it at all. And now I have at least a solid chunk of the class who are able to kind of expand what I can say from their own perspectives. It is a lovely and wonderful thing to look into our collective annotation and see someone citing Liam O'Brien and all work, no play. It is a wonderful thing in class to have a student say, everyone has imposter syndrome, including Matthew Mercer, and say that from a place of authority. It's kind of neat. But these pieces of writing and the class in general are not designed exclusively for critters, no matter how many of them are in the room. It is a useful exercise. I very intentionally did not assign an episode of Critical Role alongside these pieces to highlight the ways in which this is intended for people who haven't seen Critical Role to somehow understand it. And I think they work in that way. It's why a lot of people, not just me, teach that chapter. Is it Thursday yet? I'll say. And so we talked about kind of what my goals as a scholar are and how they're going to assist in that. And then we talked about the origin points for that, which became a really interesting and useful discussion about the state of what it means to be called professional. And professional and publication are really fascinating and slippery terms when it comes to actual play. When the bar to entry is extremely low for being able to appear on Twitch just like the big dogs, what distinguishes professional, and does professional even matter? And what's really noticeable to me, and as I talk to my students, as I've been talking to people who are making their living somewhere in the actual play space, in some kind of connected way, working for a platform, working for a show that is part of a larger endeavor of some kind. One of the things that's quite striking is how often there's a desire for players who are professional, but not professional in the way that is commonly used in many TTRPG circles. not looking for the professional actual player, but looking for the professional actor who can be cast, for whom this is one of many gigs and one of many kinds of gigs. And that's the sticking point we are at here at this moment of actual play. As I talk to my students, Critical Role cannot be replicated. Critical Role very much is of its moment, both in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, and it's kind of coming alongside 5th edition, but also in terms of the rise of Twitch and YouTube and the affordances and structures that allowed Critical Role to be more visible than it would be if it debuted today. In addition to the fact that you are dealing with enormously charismatic professional actors. But really, that's only a small part of that, although a very important part for their longevity. And the fact that Critical Role did not rest on its laurels and remain merely an actual play show, but instead really is a transmedia company, and so connected to a much wider potential audience base in all kinds of ways. So we talked about if these folks don't identify necessarily as professional D&D players, and they're the closest to reaching the goals of being, what we normally would say as professional. Many students throughout, it's your full-time job, or you're paid for it, or you have a certain kind of skill. But if it's not your full-time job, then who becomes a professional actual player? And is such a thing possible? And this is not a question that we have an answer for at this moment in time. We don't know where the genre is going. And as I said to students, our work this semester is to try to capture some data that at least tells the story of where we are right now. What does the landscape look like? But before we do that, we have to look back. And so on Thursday, students are being asked to watch the history of Acquisitions Incorporated. So they've been given the very first podcast, the very first recorded convention play, the first episode of Ac Inc. the series, the attempt at making a television show out of Acquisitions Incorporated, and finally the first episode of Acquisitions Incorporated, the C Team. I've instructed them to look at the ways that this form is changing over a handful of years, really, and come ready to ask questions of our guest this week, Kate Welch, formerly of Wizards of the Coast, and who is most famous in actual play circles as Rosie Beestinger, not your grandma's grandma, a monk who is one of the most kick-ass characters of the early waves of actual play, and of course is still around and kicking. I am so excited for Kate's ability to talk to the students, both as what it's like to be a writer and working in this space in truly full time, but also thinking of oneself beyond the hobby, as well as the kind of different experiences of different forms of actual play performance, because she's played live, she's played recorded, she's, kind of had a wide experience, and she's DM'd as well as played as performance. So that's where we are here this week. As I reminded students, I promise we're gonna get past merely D&D very soon. In fact, next week when we talk to Jeff Stormer. But for now, we're talking about kind of the landmark early moments in actual play, the things that really exploded this form and propelled it forward. And as it so happens, when you're talking about that in its earliest forms, you really are often talking about the presence of Dungeons and Dragons. So happily, it is a good week and I'm excited, and this was a real pleasure to talk to students today. We had this wide-ranging, really thoughtful discussion, and again, honors research seminars are not designed to provide answers, but merely more questions. So I've also pointed them to tools like crit roll stats, the searchable crit roll transcripts, as well as my own baby crit roll bib, which is encourages people who do research in actual play and critical role more specifically to submit to a shared Google sheet where researchers can find material, precisely because a lot of the research that's done in actual play these days is done at the undergraduate and the master's student level, things that are not as likely to be discoverable in other obvious ways. And that's another kind of way of getting students to think about the ways in which they can be at the vanguard, because so many of their peers are also at the vanguard of thinking about this. Every day I come away excited and a little bit rambly, and today is no different. See you Thursday.